Have you ever felt completely surrounded by people, by voices, by activity, yet somehow experienced a loneliness so deep that nothing could fill it? This is not the loneliness of empty rooms or silent phones. This is the loneliness of the soul, the kind that whispers in the middle of the night that maybe you have been abandoned. Maybe God has turned away. Maybe you are truly on your own. Saint Teresa of Avila knew this feeling intimately. She spent years navigating the darkest corridors of spiritual solitude, periods where heaven seemed to close its doors and prayer felt like speaking into an endless void. Yet she discovered something revolutionary. She learned that God's presence is not measured by what you feel, but by signs so subtle they are almost invisible to the untrained heart. Most people mistake silence for absence. They assume that if God were truly near, they would know it through overwhelming emotion, through undeniable sensations, through spectacular signs that leave no room for doubt. But Saint Teresa teaches us differently. She reveals that God often works in whispers, not shouts. He plants seeds in darkness, not just in sunlight. And the very moments when you feel most alone might be precisely when He is closest, doing His deepest work within you. What if the emptiness you feel is not abandonment, but preparation? What if the silence is not rejection, but invitation? In her profound writings, particularly in The Interior Castle and the Book of Her Life, Saint Teresa documented her own journey through spiritual desolation. She described long seasons where she felt nothing in prayer, where her heart seemed cold and unresponsive, where every attempt to connect with God felt like hitting a wall. These were not brief episodes, but extended periods lasting months and even years. She wrestled with doubt, with the fear that perhaps she was doing something terribly wrong, that perhaps God had given up on her. But through these dark valleys, she discovered 3 unmistakable signs that God's grace was still flowing, still working, still transforming her even when she could not feel it. This is not about emotional highs or spectacular visions. Saint Teresa herself had mystical experiences, but she always insisted that these were not the measure of true spiritual progress. The real indicators are far more subtle, far more demanding, and far more reliable. They do not depend on your feelings fluctuating like weather. They root themselves in the deepest soil of your will and character. These 3 signs can be present even when your heart feels completely numb, even when prayer seems pointless, even when you wonder if God is just a concept rather than a living presence. Are you ready to discover them? Are you prepared to recognize God's fingerprints in places you never thought to look? You wake up feeling distant from God. Prayer feels mechanical, empty, like words bouncing off the ceiling. You remember times when your faith burned bright, when you felt close to the divine, when everything seemed clear. But now there is only silence. You wonder if you have done something to drive God away. You search your conscience for some grave sin, some turning point where everything changed. Maybe you are just not spiritual enough. Maybe others have a connection you lack. Maybe you are simply not cut out for this deeper life with God. These thoughts circle your mind like vultures, and the more you try to fix the problem through extra prayers, through stricter disciplines, through spiritual reading, the more exhausted you become. What you might not realize is that this very experience is a doorway. Saint Teresa would tell you that God deliberately removes the sweetness of consolation, not to punish you, but to purify your love. Think about any important relationship in your life. In the beginning, everything runs on emotion, on excitement, on the thrill of discovery. But mature love goes deeper. Mature love stays when the feelings fade. Mature love chooses commitment when emotion offers nothing. God is not interested in training you to be a spiritual child forever, always needing treats and rewards to keep going. He wants to form you into a spiritual adult who loves Him because of who He is, not because of how He makes you feel. This distinction is crucial, and most people never understand it. They assume spiritual growth means increasingly powerful emotional experiences, more tears during worship, stronger sensations during prayer. But Saint Teresa experienced some of the most profound mystical encounters in the history of Christianity, and she still insisted that emotional experiences are unreliable guides. She wrote that God gives consolations in the beginning to attract souls to prayer, like a mother might offer candy to encourage a child to take medicine. But as the soul matures, God withdraws these consolations to test the purity of its love. The question becomes stark and uncompromising. Will you serve God only when it feels good? Or will you serve Him in the desert, in the darkness, in the complete absence of reward? So many abandon prayer at exactly this point. They interpret the dryness as failure, the silence as rejection. They conclude that since they feel nothing, they must be doing something wrong, and they quit. But Saint Teresa would grab them by the shoulders and say firmly, "Listen, this is not the end. This is the beginning of something real. The emptiness you feel is not evidence that God has left. It is evidence that He is preparing you for something your current spiritual capacity cannot yet contain. Would you throw away a seed because it sits silent in dark soil? The most important growth happens invisibly, underground, where no eye can see and no feeling can detect. Trust the process, even when you cannot see results." The first hidden sign that God is with you, even in profound loneliness, appears so ordinary that most people overlook it completely. It emerges not in spectacular visions or overwhelming emotions, but in something far more subtle. Deep within you, even when you feel disconnected and cold, there remains a quiet resistance to sin. You might not recognize this as significant. You might think it is just your personality, your upbringing, your natural disposition. But Saint Teresa identifies this inner hesitation, this spiritual discomfort with wrongdoing, as one of the clearest marks of God's active presence in your soul. When you consider doing something you know is wrong, and something inside you pulls back, that is grace at work. This resistance manifests in unexpected ways. Perhaps you are tempted to lie to make yourself look better, and for a moment, the lie is right there on your tongue, ready to be spoken. But then something stops you. It is not fear of getting caught. It is not worry about consequences. It is deeper than that. It is a sense that this would displease someone who matters, someone you cannot bear to disappoint. Or maybe you are alone with an opportunity to indulge in something shameful, something nobody would ever know about. But even as desire pulls you forward, another force holds you back. That force is not your own strength. Your own strength would have crumbled long ago. That force is divine grace sustaining your will, even when your emotions have gone silent. Saint Teresa explained this principle with remarkable clarity. She wrote that a soul truly abandoned by God simply would not care about sin anymore. It would feel no tension, no internal struggle, no discomfort with moral failure. The very fact that you fight, even when you lose sometimes, proves that God's grace is still flowing through your spiritual bloodstream. An abandoned soul grows cold and indifferent. It stops struggling because there is nothing left to struggle for. But if you still care, even weakly, even inconsistently, that care itself is evidence that the Holy Spirit continues His work within you. You might feel like your spiritual life is a disaster, but if you still desire to please God, if you still feel that inner pull toward goodness, you are not alone. Consider how profound this is. You can feel absolutely nothing in prayer, experience no consolation in worship, wonder if God even exists, and yet if that silent desire to avoid offending Him remains alive somewhere in your depths, you are in His grace. This is not about perfection. Saint Teresa certainly was not talking about never sinning. She herself struggled with faults and failings throughout her life. But she distinguished between falling and not caring if you fall. The person who sins but feels remorse, who fails but wants to do better, who stumbles but gets back up, that person is walking with God even if they do not feel His presence. The question is not whether you struggle with temptation. The question is whether you still care that you struggle. If you do, rejoice. That caring is God's signature on your soul. The second hidden sign builds upon the first and takes you even deeper into the mystery of God's hidden presence. It reveals itself in your perseverance when every natural inclination screams at you to quit. You continue praying, even though prayer feels dead. You keep trying to do what is right, even though you have no enthusiasm for it. You drag yourself to Mass, to Scripture, to the practices of faith, even though they seem to produce nothing, change nothing, awaken nothing inside you. The world would call this foolishness. Many would say you are wasting your time on religious rituals that clearly are not working for you. But Saint Teresa would call this the purest heroism, the kind that heaven notices and honors above all spectacular deeds done with great feeling. Think about the nature of love for a moment. What proves love more convincingly? The husband who brings flowers when he feels romantic, or the husband who keeps his commitment when romance has died and only duty remains? The parent who cares for a child when the child is cute and grateful, or the parent who continues caring when the child is difficult and ungrateful? Love proves itself not in the easy moments, but in the moments when continuing requires everything you have and offers nothing in return except the simple knowledge that this is what love does. This is what Saint Teresa means when she talks about fidelity and spiritual dryness. When you keep showing up for God even though you feel nothing, you are loving Him with a purity that would be impossible if you felt constant consolation. The Desert Fathers, those ancient monks who retreated to the wilderness to seek God, understood this principle deeply. They called the experience of spiritual dryness acedia, a kind of soul sickness where prayer becomes unbearably tedious, where time in God's presence feels like torture rather than joy, where every fiber of your being wants to run away and do something, anything else. They recognized this as one of the most dangerous spiritual trials precisely because it seems so logical to quit. If something produces no results, why continue? But they discovered that pushing through acedia, continuing to pray when prayer feels worthless, is what separates spiritual children from spiritual warriors. It is easy to pray when prayer feels wonderful. It costs nothing to worship when worship gives you goosebumps. But to kneel in silence before God, when silence is all you receive, and will ever receive, to pour out your heart when you hear no answer, this is the prayer that moves mountains invisibly. Saint Teresa experienced this exact struggle for nearly 20 years of her life. For 2 decades, she continued her prayer practice, even though she felt she was making no progress, even though distraction plagued her constantly, even though she wondered if she should just give up and accept that she was not meant for deeper communion with God. But she persisted. She kept that daily appointment with silence. She refused to abandon the practice, even when the practice seemed to abandon her. And then, after those long years of apparent futility, God broke through in ways she never imagined possible. But here is the crucial point. Even if the breakthrough had never come, even if she had continued in dryness for her entire life, that fidelity still would have been precious beyond measure. Because fidelity in darkness is the truest test of love. When you cannot feel God but you choose Him anyway, you are choosing pure faith over feeling. And pure faith is what builds unshakable foundations. The third hidden sign takes us to perhaps the deepest truth of all, one that touches the mystery of suffering and grace in ways that change everything. It shows itself in how pain affects you. When life wounds you, as it inevitably will, does that pain make you harder, colder, more bitter? Or does something in you resist that calcification? Even in your hurt, do you still find yourself capable of compassion? Even in your disappointment, does something in you still want to love, still wants to hope, still refuses to give up on goodness entirely? Saint Teresa taught that grace does not prevent you from feeling pain. Grace does not shield you from the wounds that being human guarantees, but grace does something far more profound. It prevents pain from transforming you into stone. This is such a subtle work that most people never notice it happening. They only see the pain, only feel the hurt, only know the disappointment. They do not realize that underneath the suffering, grace is fighting a battle to keep their hearts soft. Because the natural response to being wounded is to build walls, to grow thick skin, to decide that if caring leads to pain, then the solution is to stop caring. How many people have you met who used to be tender, open, hopeful, but life ground them down until they became cynical, guarded, cold? They are not bad people. They are hurt people who had no grace to counteract the hardening that suffering produces. But when you can suffer and still care, when you can be disappointed and still trust, when you can be wounded and still love, that is supernatural. That is God's hand on your heart, keeping it alive even when everything tries to kill it. Saint Teresa knew profound suffering. She dealt with severe illness that plagued her for years, causing pain so intense that she sometimes wished for death. She faced opposition from religious authorities who questioned her orthodoxy and tried to shut down the reforms she was implementing. She experienced the death of loved ones, the betrayal of people she trusted, the loneliness of being misunderstood even by those closest to her. She had every reason to become bitter, to grow hard, to close herself off from further hurt. Yet anyone who reads her letters finds a woman who remained incredibly human, warm, witty, compassionate, and deeply concerned for others even in her own struggles. How? Not by being naturally resilient, not by having an unusually positive temperament, but by allowing grace to do its protecting work, keeping her heart tender even as life tried to toughen it. You can measure this in yourself right now. When someone hurts you, do you immediately want revenge? Or does some part of you still hope for reconciliation? When you see others suffering, does it still move you even a little? Or have you become numb to pain? When you are treated unjustly, do you fantasize only about justice being served? Or do you also find yourself capable of thinking about mercy? These are diagnostic questions. They reveal whether grace is still flowing through your emotional landscape. An abandoned soul, a soul without God's presence, grows progressively harder. It develops scales over its sensitivity. It trades tenderness for toughness. It stops letting things in because letting things in only means more pain. But a soul held by God, even one that feels nothing in prayer, retains a mysterious softness. It can be bruised but not broken. It can hurt but not hate. This third sign often reveals itself most clearly in how you respond to your own failures and the failures of others. Do your sins drive you to despair or to hope? When you fall morally, does it make you give up on yourself? Or does something in you still believe that redemption is possible? When others fail you, disappoint you, reveal their weaknesses, do you write them off completely? Or do you find yourself able to extend understanding? The person without grace becomes ruthlessly harsh, both toward themselves and toward others, because pain has taught them to protect themselves through judgment and condemnation. But the person touched by grace, even without feeling that touch, maintains a capacity for mercy. They can look at human weakness, including their own, and respond with compassion rather than contempt. That compassion, especially when it costs you something to maintain it, is evidence that the Holy Spirit continues to dwell within you, keeping your heart from the hardening that pain naturally produces. Now we arrive at a profound paradox that Saint Teresa lived and taught with absolute conviction. God is often most intimately present when he seems most absent. When you cannot feel him, when prayer produces no sensation, when the heavens appear made of brass, he may be closer than when you felt his touch every day. This sounds impossible, contradictory, like spiritual double talk designed to make you feel better about feeling nothing. But there is deep wisdom here that transforms how you understand the spiritual life. Consider what happens when you constantly feel God's presence. You begin, subtly and often unconsciously, to love the feeling rather than loving God himself. You come to prayer seeking the consolation, the peace, the joy, the sense of nearness. These are wonderful gifts, but they can become substitutes for the giver. Saint Teresa warned specifically about this danger. She knew from her own experience how easy it is to confuse spiritual experience with spiritual progress. You can have powerful emotional encounters with God and remain fundamentally unchanged in your character. You can feel close to God and still be selfish, proud, unforgiving, and shallow. The feelings give you the impression of intimacy, but genuine intimacy is measured by transformation, not sensation. When God withdraws the feelings, you face a stark question. What do you actually want? Do you want the gifts or the giver? Do you want the experience of God, or do you want God Himself, regardless of experience? This question cannot be answered when feelings are available because the answer remains ambiguous. But when you continue seeking God in absolute emptiness, when you pursue Him with nothing to gain from the pursuit except Him, that is when your love becomes pure. This is why mystics often describe the most profound union with God happening in what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. Not because God is absent during these periods, but because He is doing such deep work that the surface of consciousness cannot detect it. Imagine a surgeon operating on your body. You are under anesthesia. You feel nothing. You see nothing. Yet the most important work is being done. God operates on souls in similar ways. He goes beneath the level where feelings register, beneath where thoughts can track, into the deep foundations of who you are. There, He rearranges, repairs, rebuilds. You are unaware of the surgery. You only know that you feel nothing, that prayer seems useless, that God seems gone. But one day you will wake up and discover that you have been changed in ways you never could have produced through your own effort. Saint Teresa explained this using her famous metaphor of the interior castle. She described the soul as a castle with many rooms, with God dwelling in the deepest, most central chamber. Most people live in the outer rooms, close to the noisy world, and their spiritual experiences happen in those outer spaces where consciousness is clear and feelings are vivid. But the journey to God requires moving deeper, room by room, toward the center. As you progress inward, the rooms become darker because they are farther from the external light. You feel like you are losing ground, moving away from God, because the emotional signals fade. But the opposite is true. You are getting closer. The darkness is not absence. It is the thick walls between you and the innermost chamber, where God waits in light too bright for created beings to perceive as anything but darkness. Trust the journey, even when it leads through shadows. Many people abandon their spiritual practice precisely at this crucial juncture. They interpret the silence as failure, the darkness as wrong direction. They think they must have taken a bad turn somewhere, missed some instruction, displeased God in some way that caused Him to withdraw. So they backtrack, trying to return to the earlier stages where feelings were abundant. Or worse, they give up entirely, concluding that if this is what seeking God leads to, they want no part of it. But St. Teresa would grab such people by the shoulders, look them in the eyes, and say firmly, "Do not turn back now. You are closer than you think. This darkness you fear is the doorway. This silence you interpret as absence is actually presence so intense that your limited consciousness cannot process it. Keep walking forward, even though you cannot see the path. The hand you cannot feel is guiding you more surely than any sensation ever could." Understanding these 3 signs changes everything about how you navigate spiritual loneliness. You are no longer at the mercy of your feelings, no longer dependent on emotional confirmation to know whether God walks with you. Instead, you look for the subtle indicators that reveal His hidden work. Do you still resist sin even weakly? Do you persist in prayer even dryly? Does suffering wound you without destroying your capacity to love? If so, you are not alone. God is with you, closer than your own breath, working in depths your consciousness cannot reach. The loneliness you feel is real. St. Teresa would never minimize it or tell you it is all in your head. But that loneliness is not the whole truth. It is the visible surface of an invisible transformation. This perspective does not make the loneliness hurt less. It does not magically restore feelings or make prayer suddenly easy and rewarding. What it does is give you framework and language to understand what is happening. You are not being punished. You are not being abandoned. You are not doing anything wrong. You are being loved in a way that your emotions cannot detect, but your will can choose to trust. This is the difference between spiritual childhood and spiritual maturity. Children need constant reassurance, constant treats, constant visible evidence of love. Adults can endure silence because they trust the relationship runs deeper than daily confirmation. God is treating you as an adult, as someone capable of faith that does not depend on feeling. Saint Teresa spent the last decades of her life in what could only be described as transforming union with God. She experienced mystical graces that remain among the most profound in Christian history. Yet even in those years, she continued to face periods of dryness, distraction, and difficulty in prayer. The difference was that she no longer interpreted these experiences as problems. She recognized them as part of the rhythm of spiritual life, the ebb and flow of sensible grace that does not touch the underlying reality of God's constant presence. She could be in spiritual desolation and still know, with a certainty that went beyond feeling, that God held her in the palm of his hand. This is the freedom these 3 signs offer you. Not freedom from suffering or struggle, but freedom from misinterpreting that suffering and struggle as evidence of divine absence. The journey through spiritual loneliness is not a path around suffering, but a path through it. Saint Teresa would never promise you that staying faithful to God guarantees comfort, success, or even clarity. What she promises is that you will never walk alone, even when loneliness is all you feel. What she promises is that the emptiness you experience now is not the final word. What she promises is that fidelity in darkness produces fruit that ease in consolation never could. Every moment you choose God when feelings offer you nothing. Every time you resist sin when grace seems silent. Every instance when pain touches you but does not harden you. These moments matter infinitely more than you realize. Heaven records them with special attention. Angels watch in wonder. God himself leans close. You might be reading this right now in the middle of profound spiritual desolation. Prayer feels utterly dead. God seems impossibly distant. You wonder if any of this is real, or if you have been deceiving yourself all along. But check for these 3 signs. Is there something in you, however faint, that still cares about not offending God? Do you continue the practices of faith, even though they produce no comfort? When life hurts you, does some part of you still resist becoming bitter and closed? If you can answer yes to these questions, even tentatively, even with qualification, then God is with you. The silence you experience is not empty. It is pregnant with meaning you cannot yet see. The darkness you walk through is not abandonment. It is the shadow cast by a light too brilliant for your eyes to bear directly. Saint Teresa's teaching on these hidden signs liberates countless souls from the tyranny of spiritual feelings. It frees you from the exhausting effort of trying to manufacture emotions, trying to work yourself up into states of devotion, trying to perform religiosity in hopes that God will reward the performance with his felt presence. Instead, you learn to recognize his actual presence in the only places it can be verified with certainty, not in how you feel, but in how you choose, not in the intensity of your experiences, but in the direction of your will, not in the consolations he gives or withholds, but in the character he is slowly, invisibly, forming in you through every trial. This changes prayer from a quest for experiences into something far more substantial. You come to God not asking, "What will you make me feel today?" Instead, you come saying, "I am here whether I feel anything or not. You are here whether I know it or not." That is enough. This simple shift in posture, from seeking sensation to offering presence, moves you out of spiritual childhood into spiritual maturity. It roots your relationship with God in something deeper than the shifting sands of emotion. It plants you in the bedrock of decision, of will, of faith that does not depend on confirmation. And paradoxically, this is often when God chooses to reveal himself again, not because you have earned it or manipulated him into it, but because you have finally become capable of receiving him for who he is, rather than for what he offers. The 3 hidden signs also protect you from the terrible danger of presumption on one hand and despair on the other. Presumption says, I feel close to God, therefore I am holy, therefore I can do whatever I want. Despair says, I feel nothing, therefore God has abandoned me, therefore nothing matters. Both errors measure spiritual reality by feelings. But St. Teresa's signs give you objective criteria that bypass feeling entirely. You can feel terrible and still recognize grace at work through your resistance to sin, your perseverance in practice, and your refusal to let pain destroy your capacity for love. Conversely, you can feel wonderful, but recognize the absence of grace if you find yourself indifferent to sin, inconsistent in faith, and hardening in response to others. The signs tell the truth that feelings hide. Many saints have walked this path of hidden presence before you. Saint Teresa of Lisieux, the little flower, spent the last 18 months of her life in spiritual darkness so profound that she struggled with doubts about heaven's very existence. Yet she continued her small acts of love, her quiet faithfulness, her gentle service of others. Mother Teresa of Calcutta lived for decades feeling absolutely nothing of God's presence, describing her interior life as cold, empty, and dark. Yet she continued serving the poorest of the poor with a smile that convinced the world she walked in intimate communion with Christ. These giants of faith prove that God's presence is not measured by what you feel, but by what you choose and who you become through those choices. You stand now at a crossroads. You can continue measuring God's presence by your feelings, making your spiritual life a roller coaster of highs and lows, depending entirely on shifting emotions and circumstances. Or you can learn to recognize the signs St. Teresa reveals, those hidden indicators of grace at work that feelings cannot detect. You can build your faith on the rock of God's faithful presence, rather than the sand of your fluctuating experiences. This does not mean feelings have no place. St. Teresa herself experienced profound mystical consolations and taught that they are genuine gifts when God chooses to give them. But she insisted they are not the foundation. They are not the measure. They are not the proof. The foundation is this simple, unshakable truth that St. Teresa lived and taught and died, believing with every fiber of her being. God never abandons a soul that seeks Him sincerely. Never. Not when you feel alone. Not when prayer is dry. Not when heaven seems silent. Not when your faith feels small and weak and worthless. Not when you fail repeatedly. Not when you question everything. Not when darkness covers you so completely that you wonder if light even exists. In all these situations, God is present, working, loving, transforming. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. And the 3 signs prove it in ways that transcend feeling, in ways that build unshakable confidence, in ways that root you in reality rather than emotion. So when you feel alone, check for the signs. That quiet resistance to sin, is it there? That persistent faithfulness, even without consolation, do you maintain it? That refusal to let pain harden your heart into stone, does it endure? If these signs are present, even faintly, even inconsistently, even mixed with failure and struggle, then know this with certainty. You are not alone. God walks with you. He may not walk where you expect Him, in the bright rooms of emotional confirmation. He may walk instead in the deep chambers of your will, in the hidden places where character is forged, in the darkness where faith becomes pure. But He walks with you nonetheless, every step, every moment, every breath. And one day, when the journey is complete, you will look back and see that the times you felt most alone were actually the times when He was carrying you, when His work went deepest, when His love proved most faithful.